Rassenschande, literally, racial shame, racial defilement, or racial pollution, legally, miscegenation, or Blutschande, blood defilement, was a concept in Nazi German racial policy pertaining to sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans, enforced by the Nuremberg Laws, which were adopted unanimously by the Reichstag on 15 September 1935. See also the German Aryan certificate requirement. Initially, these laws referred predominantly to relations between Germans and non-Aryans. In the early stages, the culprits were targeted informally, and then later on punished systematically by a repressive legal apparatus. In the course of the ensuing war years, relations between Reichsdeutsche Germans and millions of foreign Ostarbeiters brought to Germany by force were also legally forbidden. Concerted efforts were made to foment popular distaste for it. The reasons for this were purely practical, because the Eastern European female slave labor servicing the German war economy soon became targets of rampant sexual abuse at the hands of the German farm workers and overseers. The Polish and Soviet women and girls began giving so many unwanted births on the farms that hundreds of special homes known as Ausländerkinder-Pflegestätte had to be created in order to exterminate the infants out of sight. Implementation. Prior to the Nazi ascension to power, Hitler often blamed moral degradation on Rassenschande, or on bastardization, a way to assure his followers of his continuing antisemitism, which had been toned down for popular consumption. As early as 1924, Julius Streicher argued for the death penalty for Jews found guilty of having sexual relations with Gentiles. When the Nazis came to power, considerable clashes and infighting had stemmed from conflicting views on what constituted a Jew. Anything from full Jewish background to 1/16 part Jewish blood were argued for, thus complicating the definition of the offense. Some regarded the number of intermarriages as too small to be harmful. Such Nazis as Roland Freisler regarded this as irrelevant owing to the racial treason involved. Freisler published a pamphlet that called for banning mixed-blood sexual intercourse in 1933, regardless of the foreign blood involved, which faced strong public criticism and, at the time, no support from Hitler. His superior, Franz Gertner, opposed it both for reasons of popular support and such problematic issues as people who did not know they had Jewish blood, and that allegations of Jewish blood, true or false, could be used for blackmail. Local officials, however, were already requiring betrothed couples to prove they were worthy to marry by presenting proof of Aryan ancestry. In 1934, Wilhelm Frick warned local officials about banning such marriages on their own, but in 1935, authorized them to delay applications by mixed couples. Even before the Nuremberg Laws were passed, the SS regularly arrested those accused of racial defilement and paraded them through the streets with placards around their necks detailing their crime. Stormtroopers acted with overt hostility toward mixed couples. One girl was paraded through the streets with her hair shaved and a placard declaring, "I have given myself to a Jew." Placards were widely used to humiliate Das Schwarze Korps. In its April 1935 issue, called for laws against it as preferable to the extra-legal violence being indulged in. It reported a story that a Jew had enticed a 17-year-old employee into nude midnight bathing, the girl being saved from suicide only by the intervention of an SS patrol. And a mob of thousands besieged the Jew's house until the police took him into protective custody. Nuremberg Laws. In Nazi Germany, after the Nuremberg Laws were passed in 1935, sexual relations and marriages between Aryans and Non-Aryans were prohibited. Although the laws at first were primarily against Jews, they were later extended to the Romani, blacks, and their offspring. Persons accused of racial defilement were publicly humiliated by being paraded through the streets with placards around their necks proclaiming their crime. Those convicted were sentenced to a period of time in a concentration camp, as the laws themselves did not permit the death penalty for those charged with racial defilement. The jurisdiction bypassed this and summoned special courts to allow the death penalty for such cases. The extent of the law meant that the police were insufficient to the task of detecting infractions. More than 3/5 of all Gestapo cases were prompted by denunciations. Germans who had intermarried with Jews and other non-Aryans prior to the Nuremberg Laws did not have their unions nullified, but were targeted and encouraged to divorce their existing partners. Rape of Jewish women during World War II was also forbidden, though it did little to stop the soldiers who often killed the woman afterwards. To ensure silence, in the only case where German soldiers were prosecuted for rape during the military campaign in Poland, the case of mass rape committed by 3 soldiers against the Jewish Kaufmann family in Busko Zdroj, the German judge sentenced the guilty for Rassenschande rather than rape. Foreign workers. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, Nazi reports of sexual relations between Polish women and German soldiers brought about a directive issued for the press to promulgate that the links between Poles and Germans brought about a decline in German blood, and that any connection with people of Polish extraction was dangerous. The press was to describe Poles as on the same level as Jews and Gypsies in order to discourage association. The Nazi German government on 8 March 1940 issued the Polish decrees with regard to the Polish forced labor workers in Germany, stated that any Pole who has sexual relations with a German man or woman, or approaches them in any other improper manner, will be punished by death. Quote, after the war in the East began, the race defilement law was technically extended to include all foreigners, non-Germans. Himmler issued a decree on 7 December 1942 which stated that any unauthorized sexual intercourse would result in the death penalty. The Gestapo persecuted sexual relations between Germans and the peoples of Eastern Europe on the grounds of the risk for the racial integrity of the German nation. A further decree was issued that called for applying the death penalty not only to slave laborer persons in the East who had sexual relations with Germans but also to slave laborers of Western origin, such as French, Belgian or British offenders. During the war, German women who had sexual relations with foreign workers were publicly humiliated by being marched through the streets with her head shaven and a placard around her neck detailing her crime. Robert Gellertly, in his book The Gestapo and German Society, Enforcing Racial Policy, 1933–1945, mentions cases of where German women who violated the Nazi racial laws were punished. In September 1940, Dora von Culprits, who was found guilty of having sexual relations with a Pole, had her head shaved and was placed in the pillory of her town of Oschatz near Leipzig, with a placard that proclaimed, "I have been a dishonorable German woman in that I sought and had relations with Poles. By doing that I excluded myself from the community of the people." Quote, in March 1941, a married German woman who had an affair with a French prisoner of war had her head shaved and was marched through the town of Bramberg in Lower Franconia carrying a sign which said, "I have sullied the honor of the German woman." Quote, the policy of prohibiting sexual relations between Germans and foreign workers was pursued to the extent that a case emerged of 2 young German women one whom was raped, aged 16, and the other, aged 17, was sexually assaulted, had their heads shaved, and were paraded through the streets with placards around their necks stating they were without honor. The event was met with complete disapproval but was pursued to put fear into the German public in order to avoid the Poles. During the war, effort was made by Nazi propaganda to Germans to propagate Volkstum, racial consciousness. Pamphlets were issued encouraging German women to prevent sexual relations with foreign workers brought to Germany and to view them as a danger to their blood, i.e., racial purity, particularly with the Ostarbeiters. All sexual relations, even those that did not result in pregnancy, were severely punished. To prevent violations of German racial laws, orders explicitly provided that the workers were to be recruited in equal numbers of men and women, so brothels would not be needed. The program to import nannies from Eastern Europe, including Poland and Ukraine, would result in their working with German children, and quite possibly sexual exploitation. Therefore, such women had to be suitable for Germanization. Propaganda, inculcating acceptance of this distinction, and the need for racial hygiene was widely spread in Nazi propaganda. Nazi speakers were enjoined that many Germans did not recognize what is at stake, citing a newspaper titled that called the decision to punish sexual relations between Germans and Jews a strange decision. Even foreign propaganda urged the importance of preventing it with penalties. Der Stürmer was preoccupied with such cases, with nearly every issue alleging sexual crimes, often in graphic detail, about Jews. After the Nuremberg Laws were propagated, Streicher in 4 of the first 8 articles in 1935 of the Der Stürmer demanded for the death penalty in cases of race defilement. It habitually referred to voluntary relationships as rape and molestation. Phipps portrayed, for instance, a despondent mother smoking while neglecting her child in a lonely rooming house, with a picture of her Jewish seducer on the floor, with the caption, "Everything in her has died. She was ruined by a Jew." Quote, Neues Volk was a monthly publication of the NSDAP Office of Racial Policy which answered questions about acceptable race relations. Other material included promoting the excellence of the Aryan race. Even an infertile German woman could not marry a Jew because it offends the honor of the German people, and she should break off the relationship because she is in danger of violating the law. Marriage to a Chinese man, even though the woman is pregnant, is likewise forbidden, and the office had seen to it that the man was deported. A Dutch woman raised questions of not only Jewish blood but non-white blood from the colonies. But if they were answered, she would be acceptable. An article also enjoined that while foreign workers were welcome, all sexual relations were out of the question. Film was also used. In Frische Not, a Frisian character objects to a half-Russian, half-Frisian girl having an affair with a Russian. Because Frisian blood outweighs Russian, her murder for this is presented as in accordance with ancient Germanic custom for race pollution. Quote, in Die Goldene a young, innocent country girl, a Sudetin German, allows a Czech to seduce her. This racial pollution is one reason why she commits suicide, in a deliberate change insisted on by the propaganda ministry, since the disgraced daughter should suffer rather than the guiltless father, who committed suicide in the source. In Judsus, the title Jew relentlessly pursues a pure Aryan maid, after he succeeds, by having her husband arrested and tortured, and offering to free him for her compliance. She drowns herself. In Die Reichsnachtilsit, the Polish seductress persuades the German husband to murder his virtuous German wife to run off with her. but the husband fails in it and in the end, contrite, returns to his wife. Repeated efforts were made to propagate Volksderm, racial consciousness, to prevent sexual relations between Germans and foreign workers. Pamphlets enjoined all German women to avoid sexual intercourse with all foreign workers brought to Germany as a danger to their blood. In schools, implementation began in schools so rapidly that book production could not keep up. The ministry held that no student should graduate, unless he has perceived that the future of a Volk depends on race and inheritance and understood the obligation this places on him, and so urged for teacher courses using mimeographed materials and cheaply produced books. Students were given racist poems to memorize. Right. By the mid-1930s, more substantial materials were produced, including many pamphlets such as Can You Think Racially? The German National Catechism, a pamphlet widely used in schools, included among its questions, what is racial defilement? Forgetting our spirit and our blood. A careless disregard of our nature and a contempt for our blood. No German man may take a Jewish woman as his wife, and no German girl may marry a Jew. Those who do that exclude themselves from the community of the German people. German National Catechism, The Jewish Question in Education, a pamphlet for teachers, lamented that many girls and women had been ruined by Jews because no one had warned them of the perils. No one introduced them to the God-given secrets and laws of blood and race. Such unions could produce children of mixed blood. A lamentable creature, tossed back and forth by the blood of his two races. And even when they did not, the curse also sticks to the defiled mother, never leaving her for the rest of her life. Racial defilement is racial death. Racial defilement is bloodless murder. A woman defiled by the Jew can never rid her body of the foreign poison she has absorbed. She is lost to her people. The League of German Girls was particularly regarded as instructing girls to avoid racial defilement. The pamphlet further claimed that Jews avoided such racial mixing, but preached to other nations to weaken them. Sentences. According to an article in Der Spiegel, between 1936 and 1943 the Nazis accused 1580 persons of race defilement, with 429 of them being convicted. Punishment for race defilement for men was penal labor or prison. Women were, curiously, left out of the penal legislation. Some said, because of the ideology that presented them as seduced, rather than active perpetrators. Some said simply because their witness was needed and a witness need not give evidence against herself. They could, however, be tried for perjury or similar offenses if they tried to protect their alleged or actual lover, or in all cases sent to a concentration camp, which was not part of the justice system, but inflicted by the Gestapo without any legal control. When Himmler asked Hitler what the punishment of women found guilty of race defilement should be, Hitler said, having her hair shorn and being sent to a concentration camp. Julius Streicher and others continued to claim the death penalty, which in some cases actually was given, using laws for aggravated punishment if using wartime brownout to commit the offense, on which pretext Leo Katzenberger E.G. was killed, if being a dangerous habitual criminal, and the like. See also, Polish decrees by Nazi Germany for the workers, Zivilarbeiter, used as slave labor, racial hygiene, state-sanctioned policies in the early 20th century, Nazi propaganda used by the Nazi Party in Germany, 1933 to 1945. Notes